Well, good evening, brethren. It turned out to just be another nice day. They just keep coming. So maybe there's a reason we're having beautiful weather, and there is cause and effect, I guess. But as you look at the world, how does it look? Considering world events, does it look like we're heading for some good times or maybe bad times? But really, the future looks fantastic. If you look far enough ahead, that is. You've heard that it's always darkest before the dawn. It's night. As the sun starts coming, it starts lightening up. So, brethren, we have a great future. Matter of fact, the people in this world to come have a great future. So we know that as brethren, we are spiritual Israel. But what about physical Israel? What's going on there? I will not turn to Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, 29, but I'll just refer to those. These are the blessing and cursing chapters. And some may think the law of God is a hindrance and a hurt, but the law of God is protection. I was on my balcony watching people in the pool. Little children there and their parents with them. So were the parents there to be sure those kids didn't have a good time? Were they there? We don't want them laughing and having a good time too much. So we're here. No, they're there to protect them. Water can be dangerous until you learn how to handle it. So we have blessings and cursings. And they're listed there in Deuteronomy chapter 27, 28, 29. And there's blessings and cursings. I'd like for you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 27 and verse 26. Deuteronomy 27, verse 26. We'll see, we know that God gave Israel his law, and he promised a lot of blessings. And the law is what protected people from all the curses. From all the curses, wasn't it? But what does Bible history show? Shows that Israel failed, didn't they? Let's look at Deuteronomy chapter 27 in verse 26. Cursed is the one who does not confirm. Confirm, you take action, don't you? All the words of this law by observing them. Yes, by observing God's law. Cursed is the one who does not confirm it. So God's law is a protection. It's a shield put over us. And we see, if we would read through Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 through 13, we'd see the blessings. I think there's 12 blessings listed there. And then in, which I won't turn there, but Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 through 16, we see Jesus talked about the blessings, the result of those blessings. Yes, he said, you're blessed if you're poor, you're blessed if you're humble and meek, because you might think sometimes in obeying God's law that, hey, it's going to cause me some problems. I'm going to be run over, I'm going to be abused. But if you're poor and oppressed, God's law is still going to protect you because God will intervene. If you're a peacemaker, if you're following God's way, His commandments will bring a blessing even though. And in verse 17 there in Matthew, Jesus reminded us that he did not come to do away with God's law, but it would be a great blessing for us. So he did not come to destroy it. So my purpose today basically is I want to talk about the return of a repentant Israel. Israel failed. They had given God's law to protect and keep them, but they just could not seem to stay within it. But then we see, if you'll turn to Deuteronomy chapter 30, in verse 1. Deuteronomy chapter 30. In verse 1. See, Israel received God's law, but they just didn't keep their part of the bargain. So we see what God says here in Deuteronomy 30, verse 1. Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you. In other words, what does it say? But now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, and you call them to mind, or you remember them. You've gotten away from them, and then you remember them. You remember them. He says, and you recall them to mind among all the nations where the eternal your God has driven you. And you return to the Lord your God. Return or repent. You've gotten in trouble. And when you disobey your parents, you get in trouble and you need to turn around. Then you begin to realize, well, Mom and Dad had these rules not to just burden me and take away my fun, but they were there to protect me. So is God's law. It was there to protect Israel. But Israel didn't stay within that protection. And he says, but when you remember and you return to the Lord, in verse 2, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice, and according to all I have commanded you today, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul. In other words, you have come to the point, he's telling Israel, that you really turn it around. Now, they could have obeyed physically speaking, I believe. If you just turn over to verse 11, and it seems to me God is saying in Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, for this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. Yeah, maybe they didn't understand the full extent of it, but they could have kept God's law. They didn't have to set up worship of Baal, graven images and such. And verse 14, but the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. In verse 15, see, I've set before you what? Life and good. There it is. I've set life and good and evil. So God has set before them life and good. Now, I just want to turn back to verse 1 and 2, which I've talked about. So I want to talk about the return of the repentant Israel. They've seen their attitude, they've gotten in some serious trouble, and they return. And then we'll see in verse 3, God will bring them back, and he will have compassion. Verse 3, Deuteronomy 30, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations which the Lord your God has scattered you. We're here picturing the time when that will come to pass, aren't we? Yeah, when God will restore. And in verse 5, he says, then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. We think about the exodus from Egypt. This seems to me a much greater exodus than the exodus from Egypt. This is gathering Israel from the nations where they've been scattered because they have neglected God's way. And what? There in verse 6, once they repent and desire to return to God, what happens then? Verse 6, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. God says, if you turn and remember me, if you repent, I'm going to do, then I'm going to step in and I'm going to actually change your heart. And in verse 8, and you will again obey the voice of the Lord and do all his commandments which I command you today. In verse 9, the Lord your God will make you abound. God will intervene. And as we are, we get off track. We get off track at times, and then if we turn back to God, then God's going to have compassion, and he's going to make us abound. When our children, they get off, want to do their own thing, and when they return, parents are pleased to help their children and return. And certainly God is even more. So he'll return and make you abound in all the works of your hands, in the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, in the produce of your land for good. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good. He will rejoice over you for good. A parent, when a child returns, if they're being, not following what they should be doing, a parent is very happy to see a child return. And because the parent is there wanting to protect that child, wanting to see that they're not getting into trouble. Like the little children in the pool, if the parent wasn't there, what might happen? Well, then as they progress in age, they're able to be more independent. And of course, the goal of the parent is to bring up a child until they are not dependent on the parent, but begin to work with the parent. See, the old Israel relied on human reasoning and the desires of the flesh. And they just were not able or unwilling to keep God's commandments that was there to protect them, to put a shield around them. And they were circumcised physically. But God is going to circumcise them in the heart. I won't turn there, but Romans chapter 2, 25 through 29. If you break the law, your circumcision is nothing. You're uncircumcised. So, brethren, we're here this very day and during this feast to have just a small vision or a taste of God's blessing that will come on a repentant Israel. There will be a repentant Israel. Each one of us had to become a repentant to become spiritual Israel. Yes, God will come, and God's blessing will come on a repentant Israel. And through a repentant Israel, what then? All mankind will be blessed. Remember, God told Abraham all nations would be blessed. And even physically, the nations of Israel have blessed the nations of the world. But this is a real blessing, physically and spiritually. So, brethren, we're here to rejoice in that hope of Israel and all mankind. Israel and all mankind, because the repentant Israel will receive the blessings that God's law was set there to protect them and bless them. So rejoice, brethren.